Hey everyone, and welcome to Deployments 101 on Cycle. Today we're going to walk through creating an image source, deploying that container, getting the networking set up so that the containers can talk to each other, understanding more about how those containers are talking to each other, and then checking in on environment services, making sure those are running, and figuring out where we can find those resources. So the first thing that we're going to do is grab some images. So the main menu over here under images has a dashboard where you can see a summary of the things that have been imported, and then it has sources. And so a source really just defines where Cycle can look to grab the resources necessary to create an image. There's several different types. Let's take a look. So today we're going to work with WordPress. So I'm going to call this WordPress, and I can get that from Docker Hub. I can get that from a Docker registry. I can get that from a Docker file that just lives in a Git repo. I can actually get that from a URL as a tarball if that's something that you need to do. And then there's also the OCI registry type, which is very similar to the Docker registry type, but it has some advanced authentication. So it has this provider type that's specifically made for AWS ECR, and it has this really neat webhook type. So it'll actually make a call out to a URL, and it'll expect to get this base64 encoded string. And when it's decoded, it expects to see a username : token. So really, really cool with that. We won't be using this one today. Press back instead of, here we go. Let's call this WordPress again. And so we can get this from Docker Hub as WordPress, but something interesting to take a look at here with Docker Registry is I can actually just say, and use the, let me see, what I have to grab the URL here, moment. I believe it's docker.io/library. And it wants a valid URL, fair enough. Oh, and it doesn't want HTTPS. Thank you, Bryce. The form is very helpful. So this is the format here. And so the thing that I'm pointing out is that this registry URL, if you're using a custom registry, is literally just what is the URL and the path needed to get to this image. Now, some formats, some other tools, if you've used them, might look something like this, but we try to keep the image name format intact. And so you're going to just drop the image name in the tag, and you're going to have the full URL here. And so let's create this image source, and there we go. And let's see if I did it correctly. And that looks like it is correct. And we'll give that a second to download. And while that's building, all right. Great, so that's going to build, and I just want to show you that that is the exact same as the official image, creating the image source, and importing. Exact same image. And so the main thing to pay attention to there is just those fields that are being filled in are just describing where that resource is located. Docker Hub is just another Docker registry, so using custom Docker registry should be fairly straightforward as long as you have the URL and you understand where the actual image is in the URL. And one thing that we kind of glossed over here, I'm just going to kind of peek back at it, was this authentication. And so for a Docker registry, you can either provide a password or a token. For Docker Hub, you can provide the token only. So they don't really do password auth through Cycle. We just do token. Very, very simple. You just go into the settings. It'll have a page there for tokens. You can generate one and toss it in, and you can regenerate them at will. It's a very, very straightforward process. So you can set up auth if it is a private image, or you can just have that without auth if you're grabbing like a WordPress, which is publicly available. The other piece that we need for WordPress is MySQL. Let's see if we have it. So we're going to use our search functionality, and it looks like we do. I like using 5.7. I'm just going to import a new one because this one's from July, and who knows. So I like using 5.7, so I'm going to do that. This little search functionality can really help once these images start stacking up. So just type the name in there and it will pull that right up. So MySQL 5.7 is going to import and we will be able to use that. So now that we have the image sources created, let's create a new environment. Let me see here. This looks fine. We're going to do WordPress deployment to our production cluster on dev. Now I've done this in the past, and I know that WordPress and MySQL work out of the box on IPv6 networks. So I'm going to keep this as default without legacy networking enabled. But if I needed an IPv4 address to be assigned to the containers that I'm going to deploy into my environment, I would want to select this at time of create. Now, there's no way to go back and change this from legacy to non-legacy or from non-legacy to legacy after environment create. So do take a moment to try to figure out whether that's something that you will need or not need. The main constraint here is just the network size. The chance for collisions is higher on IPv4 networks. We try to push for IPv6 wherever possible. However, if it is absolutely necessary, feel free to check that box and create. For today, we don't need it. So I will create. Right. And so we have our WordPress deployment environment. And you can see that I've got my service containers here, and you can manage those through the buttons. But for now, we're just going to deploy our 2 containers. And so for WordPress, we do need to make this stateful because it actually stores data. I think it's /uploads. I don't remember exactly, but there is some stateful data there. We do have some really cool new functionality that should be able to allow you to mount stateful folders into these instances, and it might be a lot easier very soon to run multiple copies of WordPress feeding the same database, but we'll dive into that on another video. For the deployment strategy, we're just going to use default. Let's grab WordPress. It's just going to use the defaults. We need this, and we're going to give it 443.80. Okay, so let's take a quick look back through this since we kind of scrolled through pretty quickly. So we have our container name as WordPress, and I like to generally enter the container name, and it automatically fills out this host name, so I tend to just fill in whatever I want for the host name. However, if you wanted to say WordPress like this, WordPress main, whatever you might name your WordPress container, it will sanitize your host name. Just keep in mind that host name, you will need to verify what it is. If you plan to connect to it with another container, you can't connect using spaces and things like that in host name. Stateful and stateless. So the stateless containers are containers that between restarts, you don't expect anything to persist, right? So maybe web front ends or APIs or anything that isn't writing to a volume where you expect that volume to persist its data between restarts. And the interesting thing here is that we do have a volume, and you're going to get this little warning sometimes, and that's you selected an image with a volume, but the container is marked as stateless. And so even though there's a volume mounted to this container, when it's marked stateless, the contents of that volume are going to be reset between restarts. So we do want to mark that stateful. Make sure that worked. The deployment strategy, because this is stateful, sometimes I'll use manual. Most of the time I won't be deploying with Edge or high availability or Node with a stateful instance unless I have a specific use case for that. I will do a follow-up video with a little bit more in-depth about how the deployment strategies work, and they are really well documented, so you can take a look there. Manual allows you to manually create new instances. With stateful instances, the scaling mechanic would be disabled by default. That's just because we don't want people to randomly scale stateful data. So it's not something that you can do outside of manual. So we can use manual for now. that should be a safe choice for most deployments. Now, if we had, say, 10 or 15 servers, or even 5 or 10 servers, and those servers were tagged for specific uses, and we wanted to constrain which servers could possibly get this container instance, we can add node tags. And so a node tag any is if the server has any of the tags that I just added to this list, it would qualify as a candidate for this container instance to be deployed to it. Now, the all is the opposite of that. So the all is I want every single one of these tags to exist on a server, or it's not a candidate for this instance to be deployed to it, right? And so I don't have those memorized, so I'm not going to use them right now. But that's a way that you can constrain which servers this container instance can go to. Now we grabbed our WordPress image from recent images. I can show you that if you select choose from image source, you can select that WordPress Docker Hub or the WordPress with the exact same image, and then you can grab the latest one if you want, or you can import a new image here in the builder. Either one. Recent images is what I use in these demos because it's just really easy to kind of grab the top image there. The volume information that shows up here, so if there is a volume that cycle detects in that file, it's going to show that volume information here. It's going to show you where that mounts to. It's going to show you the pool options. It's going to show you the size. And so the size is how big, how much space on disk can this volume take up eventually, right? So it's not a allocation, it's a limit. The default's to 5 gigabytes. If you think it's something that you're going to be using for production or for a long period of time that's going to take up quite a bit of space, I would suggest setting the size quite a bit higher than this. And you can also omit the volume. And so this is for advanced use cases where you've defined a volume on the image, but you don't want to have the volume. So you just omit. And if you don't have a specific use case for that, I wouldn't use that functionality. So we have all of our things here, and they're all set up, and all we need to do now is deploy. So we deploy, and you can see it's created this container instance. And if I were to start this, it would fail. And that's because WordPress depends on MySQL. And so we want to definitely get MySQL deployed here first. And we're just going to call it DB. And since we've already covered most of these, I'm just going to kind of quickly go through this. I know that MySQL image here, you can see the volume. See it shows up again, varload MySQL. The public network can be disabled. And so I don't remember if I covered this exactly on the last one, but it always starts as disabled because we want to be as secure as possible by default. But if you needed access, so like the WordPress container needed public access, you can mark this enable, and that will tell Cycle install the correct interfaces so that this container can be reached via public internet. We do also have this intermediary egress only, and so if the container is going to need to make calls outside of the environment, an egress call out to a public network somewhere, you can enable that here. So with a database, I don't need to make any calls outside this environment. It's literally just going to be working with this WordPress container. And so that's all we're going to do. And so we'll go ahead and create that. And there we go. And so from here, I know that WordPress requires some environment variables. And so let's just take a look at Docker Hub WordPress, because I don't have them memorized. Excellent. Go. Yep. Okay, so it wants for the database these, and then for WordPress these, and we'll just use the examples. So database, user, password, random root. I'm just going to use a direct root password. So how do we get to that? We go to config, we go to runtime, we enable. I always like to keep things ultra secure. What was the other ones? Database, user, password. user. We're going to say it's username for now. User. Dang it. Memory is not as good as it used to be, I guess. And we will say database user password. And again, we'll just make that password. And we'll save. And we can start this container. And you can see that it's starting, and the first start's always going to take the longest. The reason is that the image needs to be copied from Cycle's long-term storage onto the server itself. And so that whole starting process the first time is that image being copied over. Once it's on the server and you start and stop, it should be quite a bit faster as long as the container responds to SIGINTs. If it doesn't, then it'll take 15 or 20 seconds or so to stop a container, and then you'll be able to start it again quite quickly. It looks like we have everything up and running. You can see it actually even notes that IPv6 is available, which if you'll remember earlier, I did mention that that's the network that we're running these containers on. And you can see here, there's the IPv6 address. And you can also notice here that the legacy mode is disabled, so this doesn't have an IPv4 address. Let's get the WordPress container online. And before that, actually, so WordPress is going to need to talk to the database before it can really do anything. It's all part of its startup mechanism, and right now it wouldn't be able to. And I know that because I haven't started any of these service containers. And so the discovery service is the main mechanism for container-to-container communication in an environment. And the neat thing here that I'll show you is I can use this hold to start all containers button, and it would start all of these containers, and this would fail, right? And so for now, I'm just going to start the discovery service, and you can click into this modal if you want to turn on high availability or auto update, which is brand new. And so auto update's just saying, hey, when you guys push out a new platform update, if there's a update to this service container that requires a restart, automatically restart this container for me right when you push that update, because I want to opt into that. So really neat. You can update, and then you can also see output here if you're ever in a situation where you need to debug whether a host name is resolving correctly. You can kind of take a peek here. And so we have that discovery service online. Let's go back. Let's go into WordPress. Going back to runtime. See all the default variables there, and then we need DB host, DB user, password, name. Okay, let's just do this. And so this is the host name of the DB. I just happened to already name it DB, so it matches. I believe I named this WordPress. Password. If I already named this WordPress as well, let's take a double check here. Just gonna double check. Let's go to DB. User WordPress, database WordPress, password. Excellent. I have forgotten this in the past, so what you'll notice here is I entered something and I did not push the plus. So if I would save, this would get removed. So you definitely want to remember to save. There we go. Just gonna double check. That looks like it's all of them. Let's save this container, and then let's bring it online. And then WordPress is going to go through all of its starting stuff. Again, it's copying over that image. It's a little bit of a bigger image. It takes a few seconds. The console's like, hey, I can't connect. That's just because there's nothing to connect to yet. Once that's running, it's going to go ahead and try and reconnect. And this mechanic has actually gotten so much better. Shout out to our front end team who has made this reconnect so much cleaner. It's so much better than it was. So super excited about that. Okay, Apache 2D foreground is the startup command, so I know that that's running, so we're good to go. However, we would not be able to reach this container yet. It's public network enabled, but I don't have any way to bring ingress into this environment, and that's because the load balancer is stopped. Now, what I was mentioning earlier is I can start all the containers, and that includes service containers. And when there's a public network enabled container in the environment, that will automatically create and start the load balancer. And so let's do that first. And there we are. We've already got a IP address from GCP. We've got our load balancer, and we can get a quick view of what's going on with it. And we just released this traffic beta, so I'm going to smartly opt into demoing it live and see what happens. Okay, that's good. Sure, that's all back. We are good. Awesome. And so let's talk about setting up the DNS to this new container, right? Now you could use this domain if you wanted to only use 80, but we want to use TLS. And so you might have noticed earlier I set up 8080 and 44380. This is telling Cycle I'd like to listen on both 80 and 443 HTTP and HTTPS externally, and then I'd like to route those to 80 internally. And so when it comes in on HTTPS, it is going to terminate as a load balancer and then route that traffic in. That's how we set that up. And the next step is to go into DNS, go to zones. I have this, let's just use this one. Where are we at? WordPress. I'm jumping ahead. Okay, so we have our DNS zone, and if you've never set one of these up before, we do have a really great guide in the docs on how to delegate a subdomain or how to point your root domain to Cycle's name servers. I will do a follow-up video that kind of dives more into that, but it's a bit of a process. It takes a few steps that we aren't going to dive into right now. However, if I do have the zone already set up and verified, I can add a record. We want to use a linked record type, so I can just show you this. Linked. We could call this WordPress. It's going to go to the WordPress deployment. It's going to go to this public WordPress main and TLS enabled, and then we can create. Now, if it were already created, we can edit. And so I can say WordPress deployment, WordPress main, TLS enabled. And so this one, it already has this TLS certificate generated. That was back on October, you can see from the note. And then this one, you'll see the blue versus the green. That's generating the certificate. So right now, Cycle is working on generating that certificate. Once it's generated, Cycle will automatically update that certificate whenever it needs to be updated. And so it looks like we are complete with that. Let's take a look. All right. Let's see here. Okay, I'm going to give this a quick refresh. I'm on the dev portal, so sometimes things don't refresh as well as they should. There we go. And normally that'll just pop over to green. And so if we go to wp.chrisaubuchon or .dc.chrisaubuchon.com, we probably won't get anything because we need to set up that WP admin backend, but let's see what we get. Will it take me automatically to the backend? It does. Okay. And it's Brave is like, no, we're not going to render this. Let's see what happens here. Interesting. Okay, so something is going on with my browser, but you can see that that is reachable and usable as needed. So what we did, just to recap, we created a linked record, and then we pointed that record to the container, and we enabled the TLS certificate, and that was generated for us and all managed. Now, the last thing to really kind of dive into here is how are these containers talking to each other? And so when WordPress starts, it needs to talk to the database. It creates all of this startup stuff that we were going through in that little 5-minute install. And then when you complete that, it saves a bunch of things to the database. But how in the world does it resolve that? And I mentioned that that's through the discovery service. And let's just take a quick closer look at how that works. And so go back, kind of rushing through a few of these things. And these are important parts. This is one of my favorite tools. This is the two-way console from an environment dashboard. You can click into containers. You can click into whatever container you want, as long as it's not just a binary. As long as we can run a TTY connection, then we can get a console in. I believe that's a constraint. I will leave it to Jake in the comments to actually correct that if that's wrong. But basically, you just need to be able to connect a console session. And so we will click this Get SSH Access. And when we expose these credentials, what you'll notice is that this is actually a console service that Cycle runs. And so it's a reverse proxy with auto-generated credentials that we can use to connect to the instance. Let's see where my, here we go. Looks like I accidentally selected that earlier. So there was some scribble there. And here we go. Okay, so I'm in WordPress. You can see all of my WordPress stuff. You can cat your WP content or config. If you have questions about what is in there, I've been in there a bunch of times before, specifically looking for this line where server HTTPS is on. Can be a bit of a headache, but how do we do? Let's see if I have ping. Do I have ping? Nope. Do I have apt? Yep. Apt-get update. And apt-get install, I think it's IP utils ping. That's a guess, but I think it's a good one. Could have done -y. There we go. Ping. I have it. Yep. So I have DB. So can I ping DB? I can. And so I'm pinging the DB, and what I'm pinging is this IP address. And so what Discovery does is it literally resolves that IP address. Now, the reason that this container understands how to reach the Discovery service is we mount the IP of the Discovery service into this etc resolve conf. And that's really cool because if you go back into manage this and we decide to run this in high availability, I believe I'm in an environment that has access to enough infrastructure to do this. Yes, we do. So now we have 3, right? This was the first entry you saw. Now we're going to see this one and this one. And so see if the demo gods love me. And they do. And so now dynamically behind the scenes, Cycle is smart enough to give you access to these additional 2 name servers as soon as they came online. And so that's how we're resolving these internal environment level DNS queries between containers. And if I need to, I can still get egress out, right? I still have access out. So Discovery Service is smart enough to be like, Google.com, I don't have access to that. Let's pass this along, which is very nice. I believe that's everything on my list for this video. Thank you so much for joining me. Really excited to show some of the new things. So keep your eyes open for even more videos coming from us. And thank you so much for joining.